Chapter 25. Ormond, Mallkallam, Gundar, and Horace sat around the table in Mallkallam's cottage. Will was on his feet, pacing back and forth in the small room as he explained his idea. Horace has told us that we need around 100 men to attack the castle, a force 3 times the size of the defenders. The others nodded. It was logical. The idea is we could get into the castle with 30 men if we had another 90 to draw the defenders away from our real attack point. Is that accurate? He addressed the question to Horace. The warrior nodded. That's pretty much the idea, he said. So, with 30 men, we could pull off the actual attack, Will insisted. The other 3 men watched the exchange with varying degrees of understanding. It was a matter well outside Mallkallam's area of expertise. Ormond was vaguely familiar with the theoretical problems of besieging a castle. Gundar was fascinated to know how a force of 30 men, the crew of a wolf ship, for example, could force their way into a fortified castle. It could prove to be very profitable knowledge in the future. Yes, Horace replied patiently, but we still need those other 90 men to cause the diversion, and we haven't got them, he added, spreading his hands and looking sarcastically round the room, as if 90 men might be concealed somewhere. Maybe we don't need them, Will said. Maybe we only need 1. Gundar snorted with laughter at that. He'd better be one hell of a warrior. Will smiled at the Scandian captain. Oh, he is. He's a giant of a man. When I saw him, he was over 10 meters tall, he said mildly. Understanding dawned on Mallkallam's face, although the other 3 remained puzzled. You mean the night warrior, Mallkallam said. Will nodded and turned to Horace, who was looking thoughtful now that he'd caught on to the idea. It'll mean a night attack, but I assume there's no big problem in that, Will asked. Horace shrugged his shoulders. He was still considering what Will had said. He'd seen the image of the night warrior in the clearing when Mallkallam had interrogated Macaddish. It was certainly terrifying, he thought. If that figure suddenly loomed up out of the night outside Castle Macindaw, it might well provide the sort of diversion they needed. Ormond rubbed his chin thoughtfully. He had heard of the night warrior, of course, but he had never seen it. Neither had Gundar, but the 3 Scandians who had acted as Macaddish's guards had described it to him in horrifying detail. This night warrior, Ormond said, how big is he exactly? He's massive, Mallkallam replied. As Will says, he can go up to 10 meters tall, depending on the distance I have to throw the image. The further I can project it, the higher he goes. But why stop at the night warrior? I could throw in some other shapes as well. The face of Sir Threknish, for starters, and the odd dragon or troll, I suppose. Ormond looked around the table. I seem to have missed out on something. Who or what is Sir Threknish? He's the Scotti demon we used to terrify Macaddish, Mallkallam explained. Ormond looked less than convinced. He may have worked against Macaddish, he said, but Macindaw is manned by Araluen. They won't know Circa, whoever he is, from a bowl of black pudding. Horace grinned now. Don't worry, you don't have to know his name to be terrified of him. He's a truly horrific sight looming out of the mist like that. That's the only drawback to the idea, Malcolm now said, his face thoughtful. I need fog or mist to project the shapes onto. That's why I chose the clearing the other night. There's a small rivulet that runs through the north side, and that created the mist we needed. Same thing at the Black Mere, he added. Will felt his whole idea collapsing like a house of cards. He'd been so wrapped up in his idea that he hadn't seen the basic flaw in it. No mist, no projected image. No image, no diversion. Malcolm saw the disappointment on his face and smiled encouragingly. It's not a big problem, he said. We'll just have to place some perforated tubing through the point where we want the mist. Then we pump water through the tubes, along with a chemical or two to help the process along, and the mist will rise out of the perforations, as long as the weather is cold enough. Will's spirits soared. His idea was back on track. How quickly could we put the tubing in place? He asked. Malcolm pursed his lips thoughtfully. Maybe 2 nights, he said eventually. We'll have to work after moonset, and we can't have too many people involved or we'll be spotted. Last thing we want is your friend Buttle sending a party out to investigate what we've been up to. Gundar growled softly at the mention of Buttle's name. Will glanced sidelong at him. The huge Scandian reminded him of a bear, big, powerful, and seemingly clumsy, but in actual fact fast and deadly. Then he thought, smiling, that a lot of Scandians could be described that way. They were a very bear-like race. He thought he wouldn't want to get in Gundar's way when the time came to go up the scaling ladders. As that thought struck him, he realized that was another item they'd have to take care of. We'll need ladders, he said. Can we get your people to work making them? He addressed the remark to Malcolm, who nodded. Then he turned to Gundar. Your men too, Gundar, he requested. I'll get them on it first thing tomorrow, the Scandian said. How many do we need? Horace and Will exchanged a glance now. You had some idea about using only one, Horace reminded him. But Will shook his head. I'm still working on that. We'd better have backups. How many would you say? The young knight chewed a fingernail as he thought about it. The more the better, he knew. The more ladders there were, the quicker his men could be up on the ramparts and into the attack. But there were limitations. We'll have to manhandle them through that tangle of forest on the west side, he said. That'll take a lot of time and effort. I'd say the most we could handle would be 4. That makes about 7 men to a ladder. Will looked to Malcolm and Gundar, who both nodded agreement. 4 it is then. I doubt we'll have time to make more anyway. And, as you say, it'll be a nightmare getting a 5-meter ladder through that forest. He addressed Malcolm again. You know, it also occurred to me that we might be able to use something like that illuminated face that you had sailing across the clearing the other night. He phrased it as a question, but Malcolm was already shaking his head. We needed overhead wires and cables for that. We can hardly rig that sort of thing on the open ground outside Macindaw without being seen. And if you are seen, the garrison will know it's all some kind of trick, Ormond put in. Then your whole plan collapses. Will nodded, acknowledging the point. I can see that, he said. But I thought there might be some way to throw them high in the air, and then have them explode the way that one did the other night. That was quite spectacular, believe me. Let me think on it, Malcolm said. I can probably put together some kind of simple catapult to throw them. We could sight that in the woods, after all. There's no reason we couldn't do that from a concealed position. Exactly, Will said, his enthusiasm growing by the second. The more diversions we have, the better. And flying, glowing, exploding heads will make a great diversion. He looked around the faces at the table, seeing enthusiasm and hope in all of them. Well, he said, it's late and I still have to send a message to Alice. I suggest we adjourn for the night and get to work in the morning. We have a lot to do. There was a mumble of agreement from the others, and they all rose. Orman was still feeling left out of the full picture. Flying, exploding heads, he muttered to himself. I'd really like to see them.